Good evening, and welcome to New Foundation Unity. This is the final class in the series on the mystical revelation, mystical experience, rather. If any of you are not able to view or to hear this broadcast, it appears to me to be working, but I have not heard from Mark, and you know how to reach him at mark@truthunity.net. Also, if anyone would like to call in, you know how I beg you to do that, but 816-301-6304 for any questions, comments, anything you would like to say at all. Share an experience if you would like. We began with an ancient experience from the Bible, Paul on the road to Damascus, and there are many in the Old Testament, and of course Jesus in the New Testament. But I feel it's important for you to hear these more modern stories so that you see this is something that can happen to anyone, no matter what their condition, no matter what their status in life, what culture they're from. This mystical experience is something that we are capable of having at any time when we are open and receptive to it. And so as we begin our time together, I would invite you to close your eyes for just a moment and acknowledge the one power and the one presence in the silence of your being from where all mystical experience arises, from where all guidance comes, from where all good comes. One power, one presence, one life, one mind, and we are one with that one in the silence. And now, as we begin to return our attention to this time and this place, we give thanks that we have free and open access to the deepest recesses of our being, from where infallible guidance comes in any and every moment. We give thanks and we access that level and follow the guidance that takes us to our highest good. And we say, thank you, God. Amen. Well, this whole series has been extraordinary, for me at least. And as I said, I wanted to look into people who have had these experiences in our lifetime, people who live in the world. At first, I thought I would also talk about the people in convents and monasteries and all who had remarkable experiences. However, they had their experiences within the framework of and the backing of a very strict and strong organization or church or theology. So I wanted to choose people for this series who, and basically, not a one of them came from a religious background. All had the experience which turned their lives around 180 degrees. And they came from a place, some from a place of despair to a place of absolute transformation with a message that could be shared and benefit all of us. Last week we talked about Peace Pilgrim, one of my favorites. What was unique about Peace Pilgrim, she had no organizational backing. She was unknown. She was one person who simply discovered her path. She had an extraordinary roadmap for how to get to where she got to. She fulfilled her mission. And do you remember, some of you who've been listening to this from the beginning, you may remember there is a theory of the 5 M's. The first M, I've changed it because it was man, and I've changed it to mystic, because especially in the case of unity, our movement began with a woman. So mystic, the mystic has a message, and then in order to spread the message, and this was the question I left everyone with last week, there needs to be a movement. And especially tonight, I see not only was there not a movement that was backing Peace Pilgrim, but there was no movement that backed any of these people. And I'm wondering if it's necessary, all of the people, including the two tonight, have had an extraordinary impact on society and on the upliftment of the whole society. Before that, we talked about Dr. Alexander, who no religious background here, who changed from believing that the brain was primary, the brain generated consciousness, to the reverse, that consciousness was primary. That's the opposite of what he had been believing. And we talked about Marlo Morgan, who had that trek through Australia and came away with a profound message that the way those Aborigines lived was real. They called themselves the real, capital R, people. And we were mutations because we were not in harmony with our environment. And she was here. She went there, although she didn't know it, for the purpose of spreading that message to all who would listen. Any who have heard Marlo Morgan talk know that she is genuine, and it was a genuine experience. And to hear it in her words is wonderful. It took her 10 years before she had the courage to speak about it. And so these people that we have been talking about, and we have also brought out the images that come a lot from the Bible and from other mystics. It's impossible to communicate an experience without resorting to symbol and image. So we talked about the marriage feast. We talked about the building and how we are all here to place our stone in the great building, eternal building, in other words, consciousness. And so that brings us to tonight, and the lesson is on Alice Hertz Summer. She wrote this book. Actually, she didn't write it. It's a book about her called A Garden of Eden in Hell. She, up until 2014, she was the oldest living survivor of the Holocaust, and in that year she passed at the age of 110. It's interesting too that for us, if we look to the very beginnings of our own lives, we see how qualities begin to develop, personality traits begin to develop at a very early age. And also the special gifts that we have begin to show up in childish ways, and given if we develop these things, they become something that is ours to share with society, with the world. One of Alice Hertz's extraordinary qualities was her strength. She was a twin. She did have an older sister and an older brother, but she and her twins were born, we would say, prematurely. She weighed less than 5 pounds. Her sister weighed less than 3 pounds, and she never grew to be taller than 5 feet. But her mother favored her because she had strength, so she gave her the hardest chores. And so she expressed how proud she was of Alice because of her strength. And indeed, she had the inner strength, an unbelievable quality of inner strength that one could possibly have. If you read this book, you would wonder how anyone could go through what she went through and not only survive, but actually thrive. Joseph Campbell says, one thing that comes out in myths is that at the bottom of the abyss comes the voice of salvation. The black moment is the moment when the real message of transformation is going to come. At the darkest moment comes the light. Why is that? Because in those dark moments, we are open and receptive to something better. Okay. She and her husband and her little son went to Theresienstadt, which is a concentration camp, about 30 miles from Prague. And before that, just to give you a sense of the historic setting of that time, Hitler was taken over Europe. He had just invaded Austria, and he was about to take over Prague, Czechoslovakia. So she saw the signs of war coming, and people were frightened. The Jews were having to wear the stars on their shirts. More and more, the Jews were deprived of certain foodstuffs. They were deprived of going to parks. They were deprived of just instruments. The instruments were confiscated. And also from an early age, Alice showed musical talent. At age 6, she composed a song. She had perfect pitch, and she could listen to a song and then go pick out the tune on the piano. While the Nazis were there, and before they went to the concentration camp, she was wondering how she was ever going to get through this. And when her mother was deported to Theresienstadt a year before she was really in despair. She had to take her to the station, help her prepare her things. And of course, she never saw her mother again, and she was in this state of despair and wondered what was going to happen to them. And this very clear guidance came through saying, learn the Chopin etudes. You know, sometimes we get guidance like that and we say, what does that mean? How would that? Learn the Chopin etudes. They will save you. And indeed, they did. So a year later, she, her husband, and her little son, 6 years old, were sent to Theresienstadt, where the conditions, you have to read the book to believe it, disease, lack of hygiene, people crammed together in a very small space, and, you know, bugs and typhus, and, you know, it's pretty much a horror story. But here's what happened. Music not only saved her, but it saved her little son. The Nazis had an inspired idea. Now, It was inspired for them because the word was beginning to get around that these concentration camps were dreadful. The American Red Cross was about to get on their case. And when they discovered that they had all these talented musicians and artists, they thought, we're going to turn Theresienstadt into a showpiece. We're going to show the world. And no one would think that people were dying here. If we had concerts and operas and like that, basically the people were all starving around them. But the Nazis developed what they called the Free Time Organization. And so certain people were selected to perform and to work in this free time organization. So Alice and her son, both being musically talented, got to live in a better place in the camp. They had more free time because they had to practice and not do so much work. And the concerts were inspiring. And I want to read what she had to say about music. She said, "Life gave me the talent to play the piano and to inspire happiness in people through music. And I am just as grateful that it gave me a love of music. Music makes us humans rich. It is the revelation of the divine. It takes us to paradise. Since my childhood, music has been my real home. It provided me with security when I had to confront my first inner torments, and through it I found support. When death robbed me of my loved ones, its meditative power provided me with the determination to cope first with the fascist and then the communist dictatorships that declared me and others like me subhuman." When she received that guidance to practice the Chopin etudes, she set about doing it immediately. And so in the year that passed between the time when her mother had to go away, she had mastered all 24 etudes. And what is amazing about this is that they are extremely difficult technically, with a wide range of emotion. She believed that Chopin was going through these periods of despair, just like she and others in Prague were doing. So emotionally and technically, it was extremely demanding. And she said, the Chopin etudes were so difficult that some pianists called them unplayable. She said, they were my refuge. They made huge demands on my discipline and strength. Here's her strength of will, which I had not experienced before. In my despair, I had chosen an ambitious project, but they provided me with hours of freedom in a world that was collapsing about me. When she would play these concerts, not only she, but these people who all loved music would go into this timeless, rapturous, transcendent space where they forgot where they were. And think of all the thousands and thousands of people who had a peaceful passing as the result of her music. Now, at the time, it actually, strengthened the prisoners. It gave hope to the prisoners, is what it did. They were strengthened not only by the music, but by her optimism. And it saved the life of her and her son. Her son was amazing because there were, I'm forgetting how many children there were, but her son was one of 13 out of some 15,000 children who went through that camp that survived. So one of the musicians had the children be in an opera. And so they would try out for the various parts, and they had a choir, and her son became the star in this opera. And here's what he wrote. He wrote, "In the middle of hell, my mother created a Garden of Eden for me. She built a strong wall around me out of love and gave me such security that I could not find anything extraordinary in our lives. And in retrospect, I can say with good conscience that my childhood was wonderfully happy. How my mother managed it, I cannot say. She says it was the obvious thing to do. For me, it remains a miracle." And he wrote that, and it's in the front of this book. So the whole book is about the power of music and love, a book about a person also who always took others to be more important than herself. She used her music as a service, as a gift, and as an instrument of peace for herself and for all those who were there. This book is, it keeps you on the edge of your seat. And even though you see how horrible things are, how she, answers the questions of her little boy in such a way that even though he sees some bad things, but the way she answers the question, she never gives in to saying how terrible it is. She wants to protect him from leaving this camp with a feeling of hatred, even towards the Nazis. Her music even inspired some of the SS who were there. And one time she was called into the office, and she was trembling because she thought that, something bad was going to happen. And he said that he was so inspired, he wanted her to set up a whole bunch of concerts. So she set up a program of 5 concerts, 1 a week, and then the whole thing would repeat itself. She did more than 100 concerts while basically being starved. And she came to the conclusion that, and this is what she would tell her child when he would ask, "Why don't they give us any food?" And she said, "We don't need that food. Music is our food. Love is our food." And they survived. that you gain a certain, not only joy and peace, but you gain that nourishment that comes from accessing those deepest resources of your being. She and her husband did not make it through, almost, but he was sent at the last minute to Auschwitz. And later, when the camps were liberated, someone who knew him, who had also been in Auschwitz, returned. There were very few survivors from Auschwitz, but one of them came and brought his tin cup to her. But before her husband left for Auschwitz, he let her know that whatever happened, that they were to protect this child, and that when it came time for him to leave, he said, "Promise me they're going to invite the wives to go and join us. Do not accept that invitation, whatever you do, and I want you to promise that you will not come and follow me." And so very tearfully and reluctantly she did, because what was happening was they were all killed before they got there. So it's a beautiful story, and they were there for 2 years. They had no radios, they had no access to news from the outside world, but the liberation came 1945. Someone at UCU, her father had been in that group of Americans who had liberated that camp. There are so many stories in here. I'm not going to tell them all to you. I don't think I could even tell them all to you. But her child, even at age 6, it was on his 6th birthday that they were deported to Theresienstadt. They postponed the birthday party for a few months until there was some, everybody was settled, and by that time the children's music had started up. One thing that happened right before her husband left was that they filmed the children. I guess they heard that somebody important was coming, and so they wanted to film the children's choir because everybody loved that children's choir, and especially the opera. But Alice's husband, Leopold, discovered that it was being used as propaganda, and here was his son being the star in this propaganda movie. And so he was really angry, but did not show it to the child because he was so delighted and he was so excited about the singing and the lights and all of that. So, and another thing that happened that gave everybody hope was that Alice's brother actually showed up at Theresienstadt, and he had come very late, like right towards the end. And the reason he didn't come with the others is that he was married to an Aryan, and so that gave him a sort of half dispensation. And so there were these music groups going on all the time. Her brother Paul was kind of a funny guy. He was thought by many to be kind of a deadbeat, but he played a beautiful violin, and And he was very humorous, and he believed that it takes humor to get through the tough times. He called it an antibiotic against hatred. And when the son, his name was Stefan, that's what he was born with, but it was later changed to Raphael. I'm not sure why. One day, just like Alice, he would get this clear, I'm going to play the cello. I have to play the cello, and so they found him a cello. Well, so when they got out, they went back to Prague at first and found that the Jews were not being treated a whole lot better than before. And so eventually they traveled first to Jerusalem, but ended up in England. And here is, on her 100th birthday, Alice found joy and peace in her morning piano playing, even on this great day. Music has been her source of strength all her life, her religion, and her safe haven. It is music her life has taught her over and over again that takes us to paradise. So, again, we have, a woman who is a mystic, who takes this deep, deep guidance and never questions it and acts upon it. An absolutely amazing story. Okay, so the subtitle of the book is A Mother's Love Triumphed Over, Where Mother's Love Triumphed Over the Nazis. I have another story which is equally remarkable for you. I heard about Kevin Hines on KCUR a few years ago. And it was an amazing interview because he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and lived. And as he jumped, he realized he had done something bad. He regretted it, and it only takes 4 seconds to fall from the 220 feet above the water. And in the millisecond after he jumped, he said, I made a mistake. God, save me. I want to live. And do you know, he got guidance. And 4 different miracles happened. And this is one of the reasons why he survived. Only 13 out of, I don't know how many, 1,000 attempts have survived from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. But he is definitely the most known because, again, he came out of this with a message that he then shared and has had an impact in preventing suicides. He said, September 25th, 2000 would not be the day I died by suicide. This instead would be the day of my awakening. No matter how often I thought of death by my hands, I would never die this way. Something else more profound occurred after I broke the surface. He said, my faith in God returned with force. I should say he was bipolar. He was diagnosed as bipolar with psychotic paranoia, and however it is described in the medical mental world. And even after he was rescued, he continued to have breakdowns, but never again did he attempt suicide. He said, "Not anymore. I felt God's presence. He cradled me. He bobbed in the water with me. When I could no longer move or fight to live, he guided me. He must have adjusted my position in the air. He must have carried me down into the water and back to the surface. Only he could have given me the instinct to resist death and struggle to stay above water, to stay alive." So the guidance he heard on the way down was, don't go in head first. Lean back. And he went in a sitting position. It destroyed 3 vertebrae, and the splinters from the vertebrae did some damage to his internal organs. But he was alive. And he said that was miracle number 1, that he received the guidance, and so he was still there. When he came to the surface, he was still there. He just couldn't move his legs. So he was using his arms frantically to swim. And then at a certain point, he was no longer treading in water. He said, "I was floating. It never wavered, nor did it bite me." He thought that some shark must have come up underneath him. It was a sea creature. He said, it didn't waver, nor did it bite me. It was a sea lion. Years later, a man standing 2 feet away from Kevin, when he jumped, saw the sea lion swimming and circling underneath him. He had taken pictures of me as I lay above the water while the sea lion humped me up. Ooh. Apparently, if a sea lion sees or senses something in danger, it often tries to help, just like the dolphins have done all around the world. And he considered that part of the story, a miracle, nothing short of a miracle. Okay, but another danger, it's not just, the impact in the water, it's hypothermia. The Pacific Ocean is very cold, and if you stay there too long, then you die of hypothermia. So he said, the Coast Guard arrived just before hypothermia set in, sparing him death in the water or in the hospital. Now, the reason the Coast Guard arrived so quickly is that a woman in a car driving across the bridge saw him jump and called the Coast Guard, who got there just in time. So there's a 0.0002% of survivors, and with complete recovery, as Kevin did. Well, that was the 3rd miracle. And the 4th miracle is that he went to the hospital, and just that day, they had a spine surgery specialist there who had been there for somebody else. So he was about ready to go home, and then Kevin came in. And the doctor gave him a 50% chance of surviving. And they described the operation. His book is called Cracked But Not Broken. So they took out all of his internal organs, took out the splinters of bone, and then they made this and took out a piece of his rib, and they made this metal cage and then used some screws to attach it to this rib, this metal rib, which ensured that he would be able to walk again. And so the repaired vertebrae and the part of the left rib were fused together. He said the scar will always be there, and it's a reminder of the harder times that keeps him present right here and right now. The greater fear was that there would be complications from the surgery. One more, divine intelligence has to organize all of these things. Brother Daniel, head of the suicide prevention, was there in his rehab or in that hospital, and told him that his recovery would inspire others. So in 2011, his childhood, and again, just like in childhood, these things begin in childhood. He was abandoned with his brother at age 3 months in a motel room. His mother and father were out on the street trying to find drugs and alcohol. These babies were undernourished. They were not cleaned, and they were screaming from hunger, and they were taken to a foster home, and then there were lots of times when the parents tried to get them back, and every time the parents would get them back, the old conditions would return. And finally they were Kevin was adopted. The other one died. He was adopted. And he had a very, very nice life from well-to-do parents, and he wanted to be a public speaker. He heard his adopted dad, give a wonderful talk, an inspirational talk, and he said that's what he wanted to do. And so 11 years after jumping from the bridge, public speaking, hoping to inspire others, and saying that every triumph over adversity, experience in some way, some small way, can be shared for the better for the rest of us. And he went on to say, life is a gift. And even though he had many relapses, many trips to the mental hospital, 5, all in all, had to have a very strict regimen, but never again was he to attempt suicide. And now he's just a dedicated, hardworking advocate for mental health and suicide prevention. He has reached international audiences with a story of a very unlikely survival and will to live. And he would tell people, I am here for a reason. I believe each of us is here for a purpose. Mine is to help those with thoughts of suicide and to help those with any mental health issues or disorders find a better solution to their temporary mental pain. I am here to help those in need find hope for a beautiful future. And he said, always take care of your own mental health before going to the aid of others. He has reached over 150,000 people this past decade, and today he works on legislative efforts to bring a barrier to the Golden Gate Bridge. And I was reading to see what the update on that was, and it turns out that some funding came from a corporation who donated this net underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, so that catches people if they do jump. There were lots of suggestions for barriers, but it put too much weight on the bridge to do that, and spoiled the aesthetics. I mean, the Golden Gate Bridge is a spectacular sight. I can, being from California, I've walked across the Golden Gate Bridge, and I thought, why would it kill anyone to jump off of here? It looked like fun to me. You know, I'm a good swimmer. Maybe I should, not with the intention of killing myself, of course, but I thought, why? I like to dive. I like to swim. Why not? And it is beautiful. The Golden Gate Bridge, at least at the time, I don't know if this is still true, but it was the longest suspension bridge in the world that connected San Francisco to Marin County. And it's called the Golden Gate because it's the gateway. The San Francisco Bay meets the Pacific Ocean. So I didn't jump. I satisfied my curiosity in other ways. So, and a Bible story came to mind as I read this story, actually when I first heard the story, but now today I was reminded of a Bible story. Because Kevin had no idea of how his desire to be a public speaker and help people with these inner demons that he had. He never jumped off the bridge because he wanted to die. He had to die. These voices inside him told him he had to die. So here is the Bible story, and then I am going to pause and ask for questions. This is from Matthew 20, 1 through 16. The laborers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, "You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you." So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour, and the 9th hour he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, "Why do you stand there idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You go into the vineyard too." And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving, if they grumbled at the householders, saying, These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, you have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you, and go. I choose to give to this last as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last. Kevin Hines, if that's not the 11th hour, I don't know what is. But we are all called to do God's work. And no matter at what point you answer that call, you receive the same fulfillment. Right up until that moment, you would have said, this guy is dead. He threw his life away. Oh, well, he lost his life and he gained his inner life that has now been an instrument to do God's work for many, many people. So it's 8 o'clock, so I will encourage you to call in if you would like. And then I have some things from Myrtle Fillmore to read to you. 816-301-6304. 816-301-6304. If anyone would like to share an experience, an experience of guidance, an experience of having a 180-degree shift in life, any questions or comments, and if you have found these examples inspiring to you, I would like to hear from you. My experience in the past weeks has been that nobody wants to call in. Oh, surprise. Good evening, Bob.
Hi, Eleanor. How are you?
I'm good. I'm happy somebody called.
Well, I'm presenting a challenge to all your listeners out there. I believe many, many people, and probably some of the people who are listening, have had similar mystical experience to one degree or another. So I'm inviting them to call in with that experience. I think it perhaps is more common than not. And of course, I was not able to tune into the early part of your classes, and I'm only able to turn in tonight to the last class. But I'm thinking of several mystical experiences that I myself encountered, but one comes to mind. And when you were talking about the author who wrote the book, The Garden of Eden, and her experience with music, it reminds me of Beethoven. When he was writing Moonlight Sonata, he was going deaf, and he went deaf.
Yes.
And at the end, he had to put his head down on the piano to feel the vibration so he can continue to finish the piece. And when he presented that work to the audience, they stood up and gave him a standing ovation, but he couldn't hear their clapping.
Yes.
But yet, it was, his mystical experience. And the story you told about the young man that jumped off his faith returned, and it reminds me, and I always go back to Charles Fillmore's definition of faith, the power of the mind to perceive, linked with the ability to shape substance. And that's what he really, really did. He perceived, he moved, and to me, a mystical experience is that which moves us beyond the physical and mental into the infinite. And I look at that young man. That's what he experienced. And I had some other notes here, and I'm looking at see where I could. I thought at the beginning you said you were going to do the scripture of Paul.
No, I did. In the very first, I did in the very first lesson.
Oh, I missed it.
Yes,
but I'd like to share.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to share my experience when I was studying to be a Catholic priest. Over 50 years ago, we were studying Pauline theology, and we had that particular story to study that night. And the reason I bring up Beethoven is because when I was reading that, and I read that story of Paul on his way to Damascus and being knocked off his horse and so forth, and I was playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. And as I read that scripture piece again, I had an experience, which I refer to as a mystical experience, because it was at that point that I realized and tapped into something, to a part of divinity within myself, that I knew exactly what Paul was experiencing, and I knew from the depth of my being that knowing is far surpasses believing, and that was a big turning point for me in my life. Just wanted to share that. But I think that there are listeners out there listening to you that have experiences similar, and they come in all phases and degrees, and I invite them to call in and share them. I would like to hear the responses of the people that are listening. If they would be courageous and bold enough to call, it's very easy. You just push those numbers on the phone, and you're connected.
And I'm not scary, am I?
No, I don't. In fact, maybe if they even call in, they may have a mystical experience by calling in. If they want to take a risk and take a quantum leap, I invite them to call in, because I've listened to your classes many times, and I know there are people listening. I even knew someone who had listened, and she said, "Well, I was kind of nervous to call in. I didn't know, how to say it or whatever." It's just simply open your mouth and speak the words, and as Bujoy used to say, it's just us chickens here. No one's going to hurt you. So, but anyway, I'm sorry I missed your other classes.
Oh, well, that's okay. I just told my daughter, who's managing the website tonight, I just sent in the handouts that I made for tonight. And Mark, I didn't hear from Mark tonight, but it is being recorded, and it goes into Dropbox, which is where Mark picks it up. So even if Mark hasn't been watching or anything, at least I know the broadcast went through. So I thank you for not only sharing your experience, but for letting me know that the broadcast worked.
Yeah, it did. It was fine.
But
there were a couple.
Go ahead.
There were a couple places in the last 5 minutes where it was lost, but then it came back on. Some things said there's a temporary thing. It only lasted like 5 or 10 seconds at the most, but
okay.
Really didn't miss. I don't know what that was, but I was able to. I tuned in right when you were in meditation, so.
Okay. Okay.
So,
to one of your points, I totally agree with you that there is a spectrum of mystical experiences that people have, some very intense. Some people have them and don't know that that's what they are. Um, and some people doubt, um, you know, doubt their experience and therefore don't share it or think it's important. But I can say that it's a really interesting exercise, very illuminating exercise to go back as far as you can go back and think of number one, what was your earliest experience of having some special gift? And when I think of my own kids, I think of my first one who he took his cars apart, and I thought, why is he taking his cars apart? And he's an engineer. He wanted to see how to put them back together. I used to play school with my dolls, and I used to take roll call. I didn't play, baby, not baby dolls. They were all going to school, and I had them all lined up, and they all had names, and they all had tests, and and the whole thing. And so you kind of get an idea. And Kevin in this story, not only was he abandoned as a baby, but he was bullied at school because apparently he was of mixed race. And he was like part Irish, apparently, red-haired and freckled and that, but kind of a dark skin. And so he was bullied, unbelievably bullied. And he came to think he was no good, and so all these inner voices. Oh, and his mother, it turned out, had a bipolar diagnosis, and she would be in mental hospitals, and she would keep trying to come back. So, these things, but how, no matter what your condition is, it can be turned into a gift that serves others. It's totally amazing, and I like his story as an example of an 11th hour where you can be called into service even as you are falling to your death at 75 miles an hour for 220 feet into the deepest. The ocean right there is 245 feet deep, and and I thought, so what do all these experiences have in common? What do they have in common? And it's like that at a point of readiness, at a point maybe of extreme need, there is enough openness for that divine to come through and give you a piece of guidance. And I think in the cases of desperation, it's guidance that you'll listen to, particularly if you say, God save me.
Yeah, what came to me is the scripture from Joseph, they meant it for bad, God meant it for good. And Kevin meant it for bad because he was feeling he was having his dark night of the soul and was ready to throw in the towel.
Absolutely.
God made it for good.
Well, and he was looking on the website too. He lived very near San Francisco, so it was convenient. But he read on this website how many people had jumped off and how there was very little chance of survival. And he's like, okay, he said, I don't want to die, but I have to die. The voices are telling me to die. You know, yes, very, very interesting story. And then you contrast that or compare that with someone who did come from a very religious background, like Myrtle Fillmore, you know, who had these experiences like Alice Hertz did in music. You know, Myrtle would go into raptures, and in fact, I don't know if you ever got one or not, but it's called I Am Satisfied, where she writes that she's satisfied just knowing that there's a power and presence. That's all she needs to know, is that there's this power and presence. You know, so in very, very different circumstances. And, you know, and I keep accumulating names, you know, and I could have also talked about Michelle Wright from the East, where, and she too, half of her book talks about the kind of childhood she had, and although we would not consider it by any stretch a happy childhood, you know, her mother abandoned her and so on, but she said it gave her that opportunity to cultivate the inner world to where she would go so often, and then she was abused in Catholic schools when, you know, and so on, and then she met an ex-priest, and they got married, and she wanted a garden like Findhorn, and the guidance came. I mean, it was just like, you plant this here and that there, and people come from everywhere to see that garden, which had the highest count of nutrients in it, measured by Canada, because they wouldn't do it in the U.S., of any place they had ever seen. So, you know, depending on what your childhood dream is, you know, and this guy, to be a public speaker and inspired people like his father did, well, he became a public speaker, you know. It's amazing, and I think you're right that everybody, you know, really more people than.
When you think of it, I've seen it on the news. All of a sudden, without any thought, someone jumps in, like I think it was a subway up in New York, and a woman fell in, and the guy jumped down there, not thinking, well, I'm going to get killed or something, you know. And so it's that spark of divinity in each one of us that moves, and putting the mental and the physical aside, and just taking that quantum leap. And so many people have been saved. There are many stories like that, you know.
Yeah.
So,
And, you know, and we call it a miracle, and yet, you know, we forget that infinite intelligence, all we have to do is have the desire, you know, have the desire, and then infinite intelligence arranges all these extraordinary circumstances.
It's supernatural. It's supernatural, you know, and I think that's, you know, kind of a good way to look at it. And we've all had experiences. We all have our life story, and some of our life stories have some dark moments, or some have many dark moments in it. And but you know, getting back to the woman who played the music, I remember Joel Goldsmith, who So, what Alice, is it Alice? Is that her first name?
Alice Hertz, Herz dash Summer. Her married name was Summer, Sommer. And
Okay.
she said it took her to paradise. And obviously it was so deep. And and she had this optimism and she had this joy, and she attributed that to the music that the talent for music that she was given. And to survive in those circumstances, honestly, but she had this child, and and it was a love of the child who also was saved through music. So it's really extraordinary. But Myrtle, I was going to read a couple of things here. This is from what is called spiritual absolutism, spiritual reality. And she says, stand strong and true. There is but one source of cause. It is always with you. You need not run to neighbors or a church to find it. It is God. It is only heaven that is given away. It is only God may be had for the taking. All the gifts of heaven are ours by divine will. This is a true statement. Our kingdom shall be made seen to us after we know that the heavens rule. For undimmed and unsullied, the high self wants for us to have, quote, ceased from this man whose breath is in his nostrils, who, gazing externals, is lost in effect. It waits on the mount and sends down to our outward gaze occasional glimpses of the glory of God, the real. And this is definitely Christian Science, it's spiritual absolutism. But
we were going over that in my class yesterday. That exact same idea, that spiritual absolute. And what we don't realize, especially Christian Science is, and Mary Baker Eddy, who kind of put that idea forth is, and it's a difficult concept, but once you recognize and you spiritually understand that we are truly made in the image and likeness of God, we don't need to depend on our human and mental part as the world we live in, and that experience that the young man had jumping off the bridge was that experience of the absolute. That's
absolute. It's there, but sometimes it takes a crisis to make one open to receiving that. Although many have died in the, jumping off the bridge. So I'm not going to, but it's like, to me, when I heard about that sea lion, that just really, that gave me chills, that one. That a sea lion just circled around and got under him and let him float because he couldn't use his legs. I mean, my God.
There was a similar incident here in Florida. There was a surfer, and he was a lifeguard for a while, and he got attacked by sharks and of course died. And so all the surfer friends decided to have his memorial service out on the ocean. So they swam out afar, and they were spreading his ashes, and they had the service out there, and there were about 30 of them in a circle. Then all of a sudden, a school of sharks was coming near, and suddenly the dolphin and dolphins chased sharks away. A group of dolphins surrounded them, and the sharks couldn't get in.
Oh, wow.
And, that's not in our realm. That's in our capital R real realm.
Yes, right.
So,
right.
but anyway.
Yeah, well, if anybody, thanks, Bob, and if anybody out there is willing to call in, 816-301-6304, I would be happy to add you to my collection of spiritual.
Well, Lassie Rosencrantz, who was a Unity minister in West Palm Beach for 40 years, used to say, if you're going to choose not to share, you may be taking a blessing away for someone who will receive grace from your sharing.
Oh, that is so true.
Yeah.
Yes, really, that's a very good thing, because we think, oh, I'm too shy, or I can't say it right, or something. Yeah, beautiful. No, and Myrtle says too, there's another booklet that is called I Am Satisfied, and it's more along this, like the one I just read. And she says that a truth spoken is worth nothing if not, is it lived or acted upon or something. In other words, it's just philosophy if you don't use it. And mysticism is where it's a direct experience of the divine, a direct experience that says, okay, turn left, turn right. And we say, well, why should I do that? No, you should not. You should follow the guidance. And that's how your faith, it was a total walk of faith for Peace Pilgrim. For all of them, it's a total question of faith. And if you take little steps, then it gives you bigger steps. The other thing that Peace Pilgrim said that impressed me so much was, she said, if you use the light you have, and this is direct Emily Cady, and I found out, by the way, that she visited and gave a lesson at a Unity church. If you use the light you have, you will be given more light. So you always want to be giving of yourself, which is, doing what it is that you love, or what you are here to do, however you want to phrase that allows you to open up deeper and deeper levels of light from within yourself.
I like that.
Yeah. Did I tell you that Peace Pilgrim talked to Catholic Church and a Theosophical Society? I think that's quite a range,
Yeah. I was involved with the Philosophical Society many, many years ago. Yeah. Well, do I have to hang up so someone could call in? Because I'd like to hear something.
Hey, I would be notified if somebody called in.
Oh, okay.
I would get an alert.
People, it's your last chance.
816-301-6304. Thank you, Bob. Bless you for calling in and sharing.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Okay, 816-301-6304. If not, I'll just invite you to close your eyes. As a closing statement, to remember that we all have access to that divine within us. The more we have a spiritual practice that takes us into a timeless zone, the more acquainted we become with that, and the more experiences come from that. And we develop faith from that. If we take a baby step, then next time we take a bigger step. And so it goes. I want to thank everyone who has participated in this series. I have evolved this over the course of this series. I want to refine it. I want to turn it into a regular course and add more examples to it. And so, again, I wish you a good evening. God bless you all. And I'll announce the next course soon on my website, newfoundationunity.org.